Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today we're welcoming another guest with us who is also a friend and a colleague, Shannon McKinnon. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you.
I feel so lucky to have you here with us today. You've spoken with us before at another event, and we knew that we wanted to invite you onto this podcast to share some of your story and your family's story with us. But by way of just introduction, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself so our listeners can just get to know who they're going to hear from today?
Yeah, this is the hard part. So I am not originally from this area. I'm from Ottawa. I've bounced around a little bit. I lived in London for high school. I'm a nurse. I did my nursing degree in Calgary, which is where I met my husband at a rodeo.
At a rodeo?
That's what they do in Calgary. Yeah.
It's a very Calgary thing to do. And then we moved back to Peterborough in 2013 and started our family. So I'm also a mom.
Okay. And you work as a nurse here in
I do.
Peterborough, and you specialize a little bit in your nursing, would you say?
Yeah, so I have always worked with moms and babies basically in my career. So I've worked labor and delivery. I worked for something called maternal fetal medicine, which is kind of like high risk specialty mom baby stuff. I currently work at a prenatal care clinic. So I'm what you would call a perinatal nurse.
Thank you. And today we're going to talk a little more about your personal story. And you're a mom, and you're a mom of 3 children.
Yes.
Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so I have 3 kids, 2 boys, 1 girl. My oldest son is Harrison, was born in 2014. My son Jack was born in 2017, and I have a daughter named Isla who was born in 2018.
Mm-hmm. And so, of course, we're here to talk about all of your family's journeys, but particularly one involving Harrison.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about Harrison and his journey?
So Harrison was born in 2014. I was not a very relaxed pregnant person. I was always worried about something going wrong. And then he was born, and I felt like I could kind of like loosen up a little bit, relax into being a mom, which I really enjoyed. And then in 2015, when Harrison was just over a year, he started not being well generally. So he had some fevers. His color was off. He wasn't looking good. And so we kind of had a bit of a drawn out process back and forth to doctors, just doing blood work and working things up. And we weren't really getting anywhere, and he just seemed to not be getting better. And then we were referred to a pediatrician here locally, and he decided to do some blood work, and he did that on a Thursday and said, go home and I'll touch base with you when I get the results. And I was driving to work on Friday morning with the vaccine cooler in my back seat, ready to pick up vaccines for work. And I remember where I was on the road, and he just said, like, how was your night? And I said, actually really good. Like, Harrison slept really well last night. Like, maybe he's getting better. And he said, well, the blood work shows some things that I don't know. I don't think it's leukemia, but I don't know what it is. And you need to go into the hospital to see the pediatrician there so they can do more tests. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, when do you want me to take him? And he was like, now, right now. And so I pulled into a parking lot and turned around and drove back to the babysitters and basically said, I have to take him to the hospital. And so that day at the hospital, they did some ultrasounds and they saw some weird stuff going on in his kidneys. And so they thought he might have a bit of an infection. And my mom was there with me because my husband was away hunting. And I looked at my mom and I was like, I have this trip with my girlfriends on Sunday. Like, should I cancel? Like, this is getting serious. She's like, no. Like, don't cancel yet. Like Barrett will be home. Let's just wait and see. And then they kind of came back a little bit later and they were like, well, we think it might be an infection or it could be cancer. And I remember like just looking over at my mom. Didn't even say anything. And she was like, you cancel now. You can cancel now. And so that's kind of what started this like massive snowball of events from there for us. So we were in the hospital for a few days here locally. They were assuming it was an infection. They couldn't keep a line in him to treat him with antibiotics. So then we were transferred to Sick Kids in Toronto. We were there for in my mind, we were there for like months on end before we got anywhere. But I think it was probably only 3 weeks or 4 weeks we were there where they were working him up for an infection. And then at the end of that 4 weeks, they finally came back and they said, no, it's cancer. And I remember that day they had Harrison on his like hospital bed and just like wheeling him out of one room on the general medicine floor and up to the 8th floor into the oncology. And then it was like a totally different world.
I can't imagine that, living in that challenge of, is it cancer or is it just an infection, right? And where was your mind avoiding the cancer idea, or was it always lurking there?
It was always lurking there. As soon as Dr. Hughes told me, like, I don't think it's leukemia, but I don't know what it is. In my mind, I remember turning the car around and driving back out to pick Harrison up and thinking, my life changes now.
Mm-hmm. Like this is one of those moments that I'll think of life before this moment and life after this moment.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And then over the course of them like trying to work him up, it just became more of a frustration, right? Because they were doing all these treatments and there were all these medical errors that because of my background, I could identify, and we didn't have a lot of trust in them at that point because all of these things were happening that we didn't feel like they were being very thorough. And my husband had a phone call with his mom at one day, and she kind of said like, well, they don't think it's cancer. And he said like, Mom, what else can it be? Like, it's nothing else that they're working up for. It's nothing else, like what's left. And they're just not saying it. Why aren't they saying it? And I still don't know.
It's a whole different world though, isn't it? Like pediatric cancer, that idea of the elevator to the 8th floor, it's kind of like, okay, we put them up here. But it's a world nobody wants to go into or even think about. So when you walk into it, and you're right, your background as a nurse probably was helpful and at some points probably a bit of a hindrance. But I think for you to say that world is a new world kind of idea certainly is something that none of us as parents could even think about. Or nor do we want to, right?
And it's so interesting that you identified that. So it's a kid's the 8th floor. It's cancer clinic, bone marrow transplant unit, and the burn unit. It's like nobody wants to see it. Nobody's getting off the elevator on that floor by accident. And that's where they tuck it away.
It sounds like you and your husband knew or were preparing yourselves for that diagnosis before getting the diagnosis. Did it feel like, in retrospect, looking back?
Yeah, I think at first we were really hopeful. When he was on the general med floor, we were having a really terrible day. And I remember his attending physician came in and I got really upset. And I just said, like, are we ever going to take him home? And she looked at me like she was shocked. Like that was not even on her radar. She's like, no, of course you are. This is just a really bad infection. Of course you're going to take him home. And so we kind of coasted on that for a while, right? We were like, she's so confident. Like she does not believe that this is anything other than that. We're going to go with that. But then as time went on.
Right. So it's like my own wisdom, my own intuition is starting to ask the question, are we ever going to take our little boy home? But then we have this doctor very confidently who's saying, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then of course that's what you want to.
Well, that's what you hold on to.
That's because you need to hold on to something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember when that word was first used, when you first heard it, and someone said, it's cancer, where your mind went, what happened to time? How did the world change?
I have a lot of like conflicting feelings about when they actually did confirm that it was cancer. So one of my friends and coworkers had come up to Toronto and was like, you need to get out of the hospital. You need to get out of here. Let's go. I'm taking you for a pedicure. And so I was in a pedicure chair. And my husband called me and he was devastated. And he was like, they said it's cancer. And I was like, how am I getting this news here? Like how?
In what world can I be sitting in a pedicure chair hearing that my child has cancer? I can just imagine just obviously the overwhelm, but the disorientation of just trying to.
It didn't match, right? Like you don't get that news here. And then to have to like pull my feet out of the water and tell the poor pedicure girl, like, I was like, I gotta go. And she was like, but I was like, I have to go. I have to go now. And just like I ran, I think. I don't remember how I got back to the hospital because it just felt so urgent. Like I had to get there, right? Because this is like this is urgent. This is bad. This is serious. And I ran all the way there and I got to the hospital and it was a Friday and the doctors had gone and it was the weekend.
Oh.
And there were no doctors for the weekend. Like they kind of came around, but not the primary doctor, not the person with the answers, right? So the whole weekend it was just wait for Monday.
That difference, that dissonance between, what's important in life, things that we do in life, and while they're wonderful, but all of a sudden when you're faced with this piece of life, that has absolutely no importance, right?
No,
it wouldn't matter
right?
how much you were wasting. It doesn't matter.
And 5 minutes before I was like, wow, I really needed this. This is incredible. Thank you so much for doing this for me. And then with like a phone call, I was like, this is nothing.
So in one moment, this felt so right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm grateful for it. And in the next moment, it's like.
And then the next moment, you can't remember how you got from there back to the hospital.
No idea.
Just that sense of time and space collapse somehow when that kind of news comes in.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
What happens then? The weekend passes and then you finally, and I can only imagine how the hours went by that weekend.
Yeah. I mean, he was 15 months old, right? So he was really little and we were devastated, but he was still a 15-month-old. And so I just remember we like put him in a stroller and just walked around the hospital basically for 2 days straight, just waiting, trying to keep him happy, trying to keep him comfortable. We sat in a hallway and cried. He fell asleep in the stroller and we just sat in a hallway and cried. And then we had this, like all our hopes were pinned on Monday, right? We were like, we just got to get to Monday. We're going to get some answers. We're going to let's get going. And then Monday came and they basically were just like, okay, well, we have to stage him now. And that's going to take a while. And so it was like 2 or 3 days. And I remember saying to the fellow who came in, I was like, can we please just get started? Like every day we're not doing something, he's dying is how I feel. Can we just get started? We felt like it was like the most urgent situation, and that was not mirrored in the people that we were talking to about it at all, which makes you feel a little bit crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And we've certainly heard that many times in
Sure have.
many different situations where that sense of when one is working in this all the time, there isn't that sense of, even although that's not fair to think that they don't feel those compassionate pieces, but I think that the routineness of knowing what to do, and you don't know, right?
Yeah.
You don't know. They know what they want to do, but that doesn't help.
No, and I've been on the other side of that, right? Like I know the machine and how the machine works, and it has to work in a certain way or it doesn't work at all. Like I know that, but in that moment, like that was gone. Like
Yeah, I don't care that we have a process and we have to wait for results and we have to wait for this person to do this and this person to look over the results. It's just, this is urgent.
Yeah. Literally life and death.
Yeah.
And in a hospital, every minute is an hour.
Yes.
Maybe when you're working your shift day, they can fly by sometimes, but when you are sitting and waiting for such serious results and answers and sort of planning and action, those minutes just are forever.
Drag.
And the sense of helplessness.
Yeah.
That what can we do? Right? That sense of helplessness.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And like as a parent, like it's our responsibility to look after him, right? Like we are responsible for this little human and we're just sitting there, just waiting.
Right. So every instinct in you is saying, do something, protect your child, take care of your child. But now we just have to wait.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, you know how they say that it's a story of mom strength, right? Like if a dresser falls on their toddler, like they'll be able to pick something up that they would never, like a weight that they would never be able to lift. We were sitting there waiting to lift a dresser.
Yeah.
And there was no dresser to lift, right? Like we literally couldn't do anything. So we had all of this like adrenaline and I don't even know what the word is. Like we just wanted to do something and there was nothing to do. There was nowhere for that to go.
That's a great analogy.
If I can just interject there, like that's so often what's misunderstood about trauma, right? Is that when the brain perceives threat and danger, it prepares the body for action. That's the fight or flight response, right? So that's the lift the dresser moment, the move the car moment, do whatever you need to do to protect your child. But then so often in our world, when this evolved in us as a long time ago, when we were then maybe like fighting the thing that would come for us, now we sit in a hallway. But all of that response is sitting in the body. All that chemical dump, that adrenaline, that cortisol, all that is sitting there. And we're actually trying to override our system and saying, just sit here and be calm. But our systems are all ready to go.
Yeah.
Right? In fight or flight.
Like just the effects on your body, right? Like I can almost like feel it sitting here, like how my body felt. Like it felt like tense. It was ready. I remember feeling shaky. I don't know that we ate at all those 2 days, right? Like you just have no desire or drive or.
Where were people during this time? And by people, I mean family, friends. I'm just interested in what kinds of things came around you at that time. What kinds of help was there, or support, or lack of?
Really hard to remember, to be honest. I know that my mom was there a lot. My dad and his wife came up a lot. My husband's mom and sister came to visit us, but it was like in and out, right? Because it was Toronto. Like we're not from Toronto. We don't have the people there, right? So we were there, and then people would come and go. People dropped off food for us. Harrison still at 15 months had still not had his first haircut. And so one of our friends arranged for their friend who was a hairdresser to come and like actually cut his hair before it all fell out, which was really nice. It's hard to remember. Like it's so hazy. I don't know if it's repressed. I don't know where all those memories are, but I just remember people floating in and out. But
inside of all of that, at what point do you remember something did happen? Like at what point did it feel like something was happening?
When they started chemo finally. And it also seemed a bit anticlimactic too, because it's like it's really no different than an IV, right? But I remember sitting with Harrison in a rocking chair in the room, and he was asleep, and they started the chemo, and I was like, okay, like here we go.
Right.
Yeah, I had a lot of faith in treatment too. Like they gave us the stats. They told us the 5-year survival rate, which was very high. Yeah, so we felt really good. Like once we were going, we felt really good. And he responded super well to treatment. Like a weird kind of compliment to get, right? When the doctor's like, he's doing super well. And we're like, yeah, like our kid's exceptional. Like he's responding so well to chemo.
And what does that mean? He was responding so well.
His tumors were shrinking. And he did well. So I didn't know at the time, but apparently kids do really, really well with chemo. So not a lot of side effects in a lot of kids who have chemo. So he ate. He never needed a feeding tube. He didn't have any nausea. We didn't need to treat any of that. He played Ennismore soccer. Like he did really, really well. And he handled it well. Like he was a really happy, like silly, goofy little kid. And he took it all in stride, which is pretty incredible, actually. But yeah.
So does some of the treatment end up happening outpatient, or
No.
How long do you stay at Sick Kids for?
Because of his age. So he was diagnosed on the pedicure diagnosis was on December 6th. The official diagnosis, I believe, they confirmed it when they came back Monday, December 8th. And then I think chemo started on the 12th maybe. And then we were able to go home New Year's Eve. So we were there from the 12th to the 31st. We got home New Year's Eve at about 7 p.m. And it's never felt so amazing to get home. And then basically from December until June, we would go to Toronto every 2 or 3 weeks and be there for 5 days for chemo, and then come home for 2 or 3 weeks monitoring his blood levels locally. And then as soon as his body had his cells had rebounded from the chemo, then we went back and did it again.
So then he did a whole other...
It was 5 days at a time.
Yeah.
In 2 to 3 week cycles.
Was that like for you to just kind of, okay, put our heads down, let's do this. This is what we do. And it's almost like a machine approach to this routine.
Yeah, like the predictability of it was, I guess, really oddly comforting, right? Like we knew what was coming. We knew this was the plan. this is how it's going to go. This is how long it's going to take. Yeah. And so we were like, okay, we go for 5 days. We know we go home after 5 days. It was always finite when we were there.
But your whole life was revolving around that, right? That's your life.
100%. We didn't do anything else. I was off work. My husband was off work. That's all we did. We lived in fear of people with like colds, flus, coughs. So we didn't really see anybody.
What do you remember about what helped you move through those days? Or what did people do? Or what was helpful for you?
To be honest, like we really distanced ourselves, and maybe people distanced themselves from us too. It's hard to say who initiated the distance, but there was a little bit of distance because there had to be. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know what we did with our time, like on the days when we were home. For that 2 to 3 weeks, there were a lot of visits to PRHC to have blood draws done. And so that again was like an anchor in the day, right? We know we have to be there at this time. So the whole day was built around that. People checked in with us. We've by no means were an island at all. People were checking in with us. Again, because it was the winter, we were so fearful of infections and viruses. So we just didn't see a lot of people, but they did check in, and check-ins are nice, right? Like just to know that you haven't fallen off anybody's radar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you go back for the second round, and that goes okay? The
second round?
Like the chemo treatment again?
Oh, yeah. The second 5 days. Yeah, we did it for December to June, and it all went very tickety-boo. Like compared to that first few weeks at SickKids when it felt like nothing was going right, after that, it just felt like everything was going right. We talked a little bit earlier, the cancer clinic for kids at SickKids. You come in on Fridays a lot of the time for blood levels and stuff, and basically sit in this waiting room with other families going through similar treatments. And you kind of look around and you kind of gauge how you're doing based on how it looks like everybody else is doing. And we felt like we were doing okay, which is a horrible, horrible way to think. But yeah, we were like, I think we're doing okay. Like our kid's happy. He's not scared of being here. We feel okay. We feel like we have a good handle on how this looks and how this is going to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it sounded like the news you were getting was the chemo was working.
Yeah.
And you're telling of that story, I can just see how, even though maybe it felt a little bit isolating, comfort in that routine.
Yes.
Things are getting better. He's doing fine. You said, I don't know what we did inside that time. And I bet you Harrison was just being a kid.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that routine, I can see how that would bring comfort.
Yep.
And predictability.
Yes. And the feeling like I'm doing something.
I'm doing something and have at least some semblance of control somehow, even though you're in a system that's in control. But
not only had they given us a plan, but like the plan was going according to plan. Right.
And you were operating that plan.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was good, right? Like we were like, okay, like we just had the biggest surprise of our life, terrible surprise. But now there don't seem like there are any surprises coming our way, right? Like everything's kind of going smoothly within a terrible situation.
So it was, two things I'm thinking as you said that, Rad, I'm thinking, yeah, that's the difference with a young child. As a parent, you're doing the worry for both of you. Mm-hmm. They don't get it. They don't understand it. They know, but
no, he just trusted us, right? Like he didn't know any differently. Yeah. He was only 15 months when he was diagnosed. So like, as far as he knew, like all kids
this is normal.
Go to this building and they get a needle stuck in their port in their chest. And that's a bit scary for a minute, but then it's done, right?
Mm-hmm. So this was a very positive as much as could be at that time. And then what happened, though? When did it keep on getting better?
Well, yeah, for a little bit. So early June, he was finished his treatments. And then we had a follow-up scan about 2 weeks later, I feel like, just to confirm, like with imaging, that there was no more cancer. And there was no more cancer. So officially in remission, he was doing really well. And they basically just said, like, go live your life. We're going to see you for like a routine follow-up scan in October. This is routine. But based on how he responded to treatment, like I don't think we have anything to worry about, but this is just part of the protocol. So off you go.
What was that like?
It was wild. It was crazy. And it was just like a really lovely summer. And we just did all the things because we'd basically just been housebound for 6 months or whatever it was. And so we, if people said like, do you want to do this? We were like, yep. Yeah, let's do that. Let's go to a cottage. Let's go to the zoo. Let's go to the park. Let's do it all. In that summer, I also found out I was expecting my second son, Jack. And so everything was feeling really good and positive and really lovely. And then we came into the fall, and the fall is when Harrison had started to not be well, basically, initially. And I started feeling like maybe things were headed that direction again. And everyone told me I was crazy, that it was just like the anniversary, and that I was a little bit, everyone had told me I was crazy the first time around too. And I was being a bit of a psycho mom. And then it started all over again in the fall, where I was like, I don't know, I feel like he's got a bit of a limp there. Like, I don't know, like something doesn't feel right. When we initially went for the diagnosis at Sick Kids, I remember them asking me what his symptoms were, and I kind of ran through the list, and then I always finished up with like, he doesn't smell right. Like his breath smells wrong. And they were like, okay, you're nuts. And then in the fall, when he was in remission, he started to not smell right again. And again, everyone told me I was crazy. Everything's fine. And I remember calling Sick Kids and saying like, I think we need to do this scan sooner. Like, I think it's happening again. And they kind of said like, like 2 weeks is no big deal. We have our appointment in 2 weeks. We'll do the scan in 2 weeks. And I was like, I don't feel comfortable waiting 2 weeks. They're like, it's fine. Like, I understand why you're feeling anxious, but we'll stick to our original appointment. And so we went back for that routine 4-month scan in October, and it was back.
Before we turn this corner, would you be okay if you took a little bit of time to tell us who Harrison? Tell us about him. What did he like? What did he not like?
Yeah.
What was he like as a kid?
He laughed all the time. Like, he would laugh at anything. Like, he was so easy to entertain because everything was funny. He was really joyful. You could just see it in his eyes. Like, he was just like happy eyes, Right. Yeah, he was just like really silly and goofy, and he always did like these funny little dances. Whenever there was a song that he liked, a relative had sent him, those musical cards. Mm-hmm. You like open it and the song plays. And I can't remember what song it was, but he like walked around the house all day, just like opening it up and thinking it was so hilarious, and then closing it again, and then like opening it up. And he thought it was so amazing. He had made a little friend at daycare. Like, they were like quite close and hung out all the time. It was like really nice to see him connecting with like a peer, because he didn't have a lot of that connection in his first couple years of life. Yeah, he was just like a really sweet, very sweet little boy.
And he loved Superman?
He loved Superman. He loved Splash and Boots. Do you guys know Splash and Boots?
Yes.
It's a Canadian kids musical duo who are incredible. So we first encountered them at Sick Kids in the first round of his treatment. They volunteer their time and go and play in the library at Sick Kids. So you can go down and watch this like little mini concert down there. So that's how we came across them. Yeah, so he loved Splash and Boots. I think Bab Boots, he called them. Splash and Boots, Superman, anything superhero, just the usual kid stuff.
What was his favorite food?
Avocado.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Avocado.
Wow.
Yeah. All
He was
my
ahead
kids,
of his time.
all of my
toast
kids
sensation.
have been into avocados, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Was not expecting that.
Yeah,
No.
right? Yeah, he ate everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was not a picky kid at all.
Did you have a favorite toy?
He had a few. He had his Lammy, so his little it's like the top part's a stuffy and the bottom part's like a mini blanket kind of thing. So he had this little Lammy that he just loved like crazy. And we had one Lammy, and then when we went to Sick Kids initially, we were like, we're going to need a lot more Lammies. So we bought, I think, 2 more just in case something happened to the original Lammy, because he got a lot of comfort from it. But he rejected new imposter Lammy initially, right? Because it wasn't worn down and nubbined like a stuffy should be.
Don't they?
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up having to have him sleep with 3 Lammies for a while so that the others got worn down.
It was a little herd.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call several lambs together, but
Oh, I don't know.
yeah.
Heard.
Yeah, but by the end of his treatment, over the course of the 2 years, we had 5 Lammies, I think, in total. So there's Lammy. He had this little Thomas the Tank Engine, little plastic toy. And he had a few, like he had a lot of little trains, but this one for whatever reason was the good one. And he used to hold it and like rub his thumb over the face of it. Like it was a bit like, I guess, textured. And he wore like the face right off of Thomas. So it was just this like little blank face Thomas that he had. He had a couple little Superman figures that he liked to have. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You kind of picture it, right?
Yeah. Well, I can imagine original Lammy or Lammy 1, if we want to swing this sort of back, it probably not only had a feel, but it probably had a smell.
Yes.
And new Lammies don't have the right smell.
New Lammies do not have the right smell.
And you were noticing that Harrison didn't have the right smell.
Yeah.
Right? Something's wrong.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
What happened then? You said, let's push this. Let's get this done sooner. And you sort of said, no, we can wait a couple of weeks.
Yeah. So, well, then we went and they did the scan and I was right. And after that, it was just like we had gotten there for the scan and we were at the top of the hill. And then as soon as the scan came back showing there was cancer, it's like we rolled down the other side. Like it was so quick. Like we didn't leave the hospital that day. They put in a port the same day. People who have heard my story before know that a lot of the frustration initially when he was diagnosed the first time was that they wanted to put this port in to start his treatment, and so they had him like no food or mouth for like days at a time because he was on call for the surgical schedule. He wasn't on the slate, so we just waited and waited and waited for days for this port to be put in. And this time it was same day, like scan in the morning, port in the afternoon, like the ball was rolling quickly. And I remember talking to his doctor when she told us. And so in the cancer clinic at Sick Kids, the Sears Clinic, I think it's called, they have these little exam rooms and they're kind of like, they get used all the time, right? And so you can tell they've been used all the time. So like there's like dents in the exam table and stuff like that. And after the scan, they sent us to this like beautiful, pristine room with couches. And we were like, this is not the good news room. This is not good. And they brought in like a team. So it was our primary oncologist, who is wonderful. Sarah Alexander is her name, and a team, like some residents and a fellow and whatever. And remember her telling me what the plan was. And so the plan was we were going to start the second line treatment. So like in the cancer world, like if you have this kind of cancer, you do this protocol. And then if that protocol doesn't work or the cancer comes back, then you do this. Like there's always a second line. And she's like, we're going to do the second line treatment. And then if that doesn't work, actually, no, at that point, it wasn't even that. It was, we're going to do the second line treatment and then hope that the cancer goes away. And then we're going to go to a stem cell transplant. You need to be cancer free to qualify for a stem cell transplant. So she's like, we're going to do second line and we're going to go to a stem cell transplant. And we were like, so what's the timeline here? Because that was October and Jack was due in January. And she was like, we're going to aim for the first week of February. And I was like, can I swear?
Yes.
I was like, and I just said to her, I was like, this is fucked. Like, this is fucked. Mm-hmm. I was like, how are we going to do this? And she's like, don't worry. We'll be here for you. We'll be supporting you. You can do this. Everyone's behind you. And we're like, okay.
So a child whose cancer has come back will have major interventions, and I'm going to have a baby during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for anyone who's not familiar with stem cell transplant, it's like not an easy or simple process. So the prep is basically like high dose radiation and chemo. He'd not had radiation yet. So you basically do like this really intensive 5 days, I think it was, leading up to the stem cell transplant. And then you do the stem cell transplant. And then basically you are like profoundly immunocompromised from the radiation and the chemo. And so you're in the hospital for potentially like months, like 2 or 3 months. You're isolated in a hospital room. You cannot leave the hospital room. You're very prone to infection. Like something that wouldn't cause an infection in a healthy person could be deadly for a person after stem cell transplant. So this is basically what they were telling us our life was going to look like with a brand new baby. So we did the second line treatment and it didn't work. So the cancer kept growing. He had a really, really big tumor on his back that just kept growing and growing. And we kept saying like, what is this? And they were like, well, we think it's just debris from the tumor kind of breaking up. And we were like, okay. And then it kept growing and growing and growing. And we had to give Harrison morphine because it was so painful for him. This like massive softball sized lump on his back. And I remember they sent us home from the clinic one Friday and they were like, okay, well, because I had said, I was like, the skin is so tight, it looks like it's going to burst. And they were like, okay, well, if you take this sterile cup, if it does burst, if you can collect some of what comes out of it so that we can send it for pathology. And I was like, okay, sure, we'll do that. And we got down to the parking garage and we were putting him in his car seat and the thing ruptured. And good little nurse that I am, I was like, oh, we need the cup. Like, we need to collect this. Like, they need it for pathology, which is crazy. So I collected it and ran it back up the elevator and gave it to them. And it was cancer, basically. It was just like a whole bunch of cancer cells that I had collected in this sterile cup. And so then he had this like gaping hole in his back that we had to treat at home. And because that's my background, that was my role at home. So my husband would hold him because he didn't like it being dressed. And so my husband would like restrain him basically. And I would like change the dressing and clean it up and dress it again. It was awful. And then they switched him to a different chemo. And then that chemo didn't work. And then they basically said, we have a Hail Mary chemo. It's a drug that's not been tested in the pediatric population. And so that's when you know that you're like not in a good place, right? Things are not looking good if you are now the human experiment. But they had this drug and it was an oral drug, which meant we kept it in our bar fridge in the basement bar. And he had like this little shot of this medication every morning that tasted horrible, but it worked. And so that hole started shrinking and closing up and the scans started looking better. And so things were looking good again. I had Jack in that time and things were looking a little bit better because the chemos that hadn't worked had delayed the timeline. So then we were looking at March. So we had just under 2 months at home with Harrison doing okay and Jack as a new baby before we had to pack up and move to Toronto, which we did because Jack was a newborn. And I was breastfeeding. My husband stayed overnight in the hospital with Harrison each night. And I stayed at Ronald McDonald House with my mom. My mom would then look after Jack during the day. And I would go to the hospital and Barrett would come back to Ronald McDonald House and sleep because you don't get sleep in the hospital. And then we just did that for March 20th was his stem cell transplant. And I think it was like the end of April when we were discharged to Ronald McDonald House. And so all of that time in like maybe a 12 by 12 hospital room that he couldn't leave. So we were basically trying to entertain like a 2.5-year-old in a 12 by 12 room for 6 weeks.
How would you do that? What would you do?
We had toys and stuff. So everything had to be sterilized. So before we went to Toronto, we had bought all the secondhand Lego and we like boiled it batch by batch. So it was sterile. And then we packaged it into different freezer bags. So we had probably like 20 freezer bags of Lego. We did that with various other toys. And so like each day he would get like a new clean Ziploc of toys. All of his clothes that we washed at Ronald McDonald House had to be packaged into Ziploc bags to go into the hospital room. Any toy that hit the floor had to be wiped before he could touch it again. They had these mats down on the floor next to his bed, and those had to be like wiped down with Cavi wipes before he could play on them. Basically, everything had to be wiped. I remember freaking out on my dad at one point because everything had to be, you know, like on the dryer settings, they had told us like when you wash and dry your clothes, you have to have your clothes on the like maximum heat setting because if they're even a little bit damp,
Things can grow in them.
Things can grow. So you have to maximum heat everything. And my dad, who had come to support us in the hospital, so my mom was at Ronald McDonald House with Jack, and my dad had come to kind of offset some of the entertainment in the hospital. So he had rented a hotel room in Toronto for 6 weeks. And I realized about like 3 weeks in that my dad had been like sink washing his pants and then hanging them to dry. And I lost it on him. And I feel so terrible for that. But I was like, Dad, like what's in your pants, which is insane.
But everything's a threat.
Everything is a threat. Like
danger is
we
everywhere.
Cavi wiped our cell phones before we went into the room. Barrett like Cavi wiped his wallet because he would put it down on the coffee shop counter when he bought his coffee. So we wiped everything. So that's like the level of threat that we felt like we were living under there. And then finally it looked like his stem cells were were like taking, engrafting is what it's called. So his body was accepting them. And so that felt really good because we were like, okay, again, we're like, it's going the way it's supposed to now. Like things are improving. And then 3 weeks after his stem cell transplant, they came and they were like, oh, we've done some blood work and it looks like his body is rejecting the graft is what they call it, or the stem cell donation. And we were like, so what does that mean? And they basically just said like, well, then all he's left with is his own immune system and his own cells. So what that means basically is like his body and his immune system that couldn't resist the cancer the first time was all that we were left with again. Plus the fact that we had like killed his natural immune system for the stem cell transplant. And so basically he had no protection against anything. And so that was like a really low moment, but they did another scan and there was still no cancer. And we were like, okay, we'll carry on. And then they discharged us to Ronald McDonald House and we lived there for 2 weeks, I feel like daily visits back to the hospital. And then they finally told us that we could go home. So we went home. And so after a stem cell transplant, they say that you have to get to day 100 to be kind of like a little bit out of the woods in terms of like immune system. And so we were home and we were like kind of back and forth to sick kids a few times. Like every time he had a fever, it was an emergency. It potentially could be an emergency. So we packed up and went back to Toronto until they told us we could go home, which was usually a week at a time. And we were at, I think, day 82. And Barrett had gone out to get groceries. Jack was asleep in his little baby swing. Harrison called them the baby robots. He's like, put the baby in the rebot. We'd be like, okay. So Jack was in his baby robot and Harrison was down for a nap and Barrett was out. And then I remember hearing Harrison, like his voice a little bit and I didn't know what he was saying. And I kind of like opened the door to his bedroom and he was like, help me. Need help me, mommy. And I flicked on the light and he had vomited all over his bed and he was having trouble breathing. And so I carried him out to the living room couch and I put him on his side and I could see that when he was vomiting, he was aspirating it. Like he was like holding it in. And his lips were turning blue. So I called an ambulance. It took what felt like forever, which I'm sure is how everybody feels when they call an ambulance. And I remember they got there and they did not take me seriously. They put a SAT probe on him and his O2 sats were below 80. They should be like 92 or higher. And I remember saying like, and they were just kind of taking his history. Like they were like, so he had a stem cell transplant. When was that? And I was like, there's a kid with blue lips on the couch and his sats are like 78. Like, can we talk about this later? And they were like, oh no, that's probably just the monitor's probably not working right. And I was like, the monitor is working. Like, can we just get going? And so I'd called Barrett and he was racing back. And then one of the neighbors had seen that an ambulance had pulled up. And so she just like came in and she's like, I'll watch Jack, you go. And so they finally took a wrong turn on the way to the hospital, which was so frustrating. Anyway, so we got to PRHC and they kind of like queued up to wait for the ambulance, like the nurse to triage the ambulance stretchers. And I remember looking at him again and he was blue and his sats were dropping. And I was like, can somebody please help me? And I remember the nurse looked up and took one look at him and was like, just like took the stretcher and ran to the trauma bay. And then it was just like everybody was there. And they were talking about intubating him, which they didn't have to do at that time. Basically, they transferred us from there by ambulance back to sick kids. They admitted him to the critical care unit. The next morning, they tried him on like a CPAP or something, like a face mask, and he kept trying to pull it off. And so they basically said, we have to intubate him. And to intubate him, we have to sedate him. And we were like, okay, like do what you need to do. And so they sedated him and intubated him. And we never saw his eyes open again.
I can't imagine all of this with and then Jack, and you must have been terrified of Jack, something happening to him too.
Since then, yes. We're maybe growing out of it a little bit. In those moments in the CCU, like, I think I forgot that I had another baby, to be honest. I hope he never hears this podcast. Yeah, it wasn't on my radar at all. Like, you're just so hyper-focused in the moment. And then after Harrison died, I swung completely the other way. So I was hyper-focused on Jack, hyper-focused on his health. When he was teething and he had fevers all the time, because that's how it started when Harrison was sick. Yes. That was so difficult. All of my healthcare worker connections, like the people that we'd come to know in POP clinic, the pediatric clinic at the hospital, through Harrison's illness, like I would just like text them and call them constantly and be like, what about this? Like, what do I need to come in? Like, what do I do about this? Because it's almost like we had gotten so used to living in an emergency. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden there was no emergency, but we were still like prepped for one.
And what if this is an emergency too?
Yeah.
And yeah. So that hypervigilance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember some parents who told me, and their child had died, gone through this process. And I remember, him saying, I still have to fill the car up when it gets to half empty, because we always had to have a full tank of gas because we never knew when we had to go to Toronto.
Oh, yeah.
And this was back when, stations weren't necessarily open 24/7.
Yeah.
But that kind of idea of my life, those things have to be in order because I may have to respond to a crisis, right?
Yeah, and that didn't stop for us with Harrison's death. Like we'd have the car filled. You always in the back of your mind had like a bit of a packing list, right? Like if I only have 5 minutes, what do I need to grab? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like we were like training for a house fire at all times, right? Like what are the most important things that we need to get, and we need to be out of here as quickly as possible. And then after Harrison died, it was kind of the same, and it felt a little bit empty without all of this rushing around or like emergent situation that needed to be handled and like controlled and dealt with. And we were just kind of like adrift in the world with like really, it felt like no purpose anymore.
Yeah. That makes so much sense to me. And again, from even like a nervous system perspective, it's like the norm became that fight or flight response. Like, be ready to go.
Yeah.
Be ready to move into action. There's danger everywhere, even though I may not be able to see it, but be ready.
And it's so interesting to me that like we're doing this conversation today. So there's this big like tech event that's happened, right? And like things are shutting down, nothing's working the way it should. And I had a moment this morning where I was like, oh, I'm comfortable in this. Like this is okay. Right? Everyone else is feeling anxious about it. And I was like, oh, this feels familiar.
Yeah. I know what it feels like when the world turns upside down.
7 years later.
Yes. Yeah. And for whenever people may listen to this is the day on which Microsoft failure all around the world that's impacting all of our major financial systems, airlines, all of
hospitals,
that.
Everything.
Hospitals, everyone. Yeah.
And that feels comfortable.
So your nervous system goes, oh yeah, I know this. I know how to operate under these
I'm
conditions.
good at this.
Yeah.
Like Barrett and I always say like, okay, like we're good in a crisis. Like we got this.
Right. Did you feel that way when the pandemic hit too?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I think a lot of people really struggled in the pandemic, and we were like, oh, we've done this. We've isolated ourselves. We've not seen people for months on end. Yeah. We've lived like way up high. Like our nervous system has been running at this level for a long time. Like we're fine.
Mm-hmm. It's an instrument that goes right back to the pedicure and sitting in the hospital with nothing to do for a weekend and being in that place.
Yeah.
And that becomes the norm.
Mm-hmm. And I truly think that maybe it isn't all the time like it used to be, but like that is almost where I'm most comfortable and I feel most competent and feels most familiar. Mm-hmm. Like dropping the kids off at summer camp this morning, and then I had an hour before coming here and I was like, this isn't very exciting. Like, like
where's the running, the pushing?
Where's the running? Next? Where's the urgency?
Yeah.
Like
that's what's comfortable.
Do you think that's somehow protective in that if you relax and let your guard down, something bad could happen?
It's going to happen again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. Mm-hmm. So it's good to keep the temperature high.
Yeah. Well, I think it was David who said to me, he's like, you can't tell somebody who's been struck by lightning that lightning doesn't strike twice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's always there. And I know this isn't about the grief side, but there's still that sense where that hypervigilance until your kid, and you went on to have a beautiful daughter too.
Mm-hmm.
But, until they reach that age where Harrison, like once Jack reached Harrison's age,
Yeah.
your mind just plays those games of, what if it's
And I don't even think it stopped then, right? Like I've been very fortunate that I have like Jack and Isla are very healthy kids. I don't know what I would do if Jack or Isla had like a medical need or, like they're very healthy kids. I think Isla has like inoculated me a little bit because she's a bit crazy. And so there were a lot of like head injuries and stuff. So I'm not as jumpy with injuries as much anymore. But the saying in our house is like, don't do that. We don't want to go to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't want to go to the hospital. Mm-hmm. Bad things for us happen at hospitals. Mm-hmm. When we try not to be that way with our kids, because I don't want the way that we've learned to be to influence who they learn to be.
Mm-hmm. And I think, even as you say that about, I don't know what I'd do if one of my other kids, I mean, that comes right back to that whole idea as soon as people know your story, I mean, the first response is often, well, I can't imagine as a parent having to do that. I can't imagine that I could do that. Well, we don't get a choice, do
No.
we? And you would have said the same thing earlier too. None of us can imagine. And then it happens and we have to deal with it.
And
right?
I'm a completely different person. Like I don't really recognize the person. It's almost like I'm two different people, right? There's the me that was before and the me that is now, and we're not the same. I don't identify with her at all. I would say that I was probably naive and probably really like self-centered and I wouldn't have considered that something like this could happen to me, right? Because like stuff like this doesn't happen to people like me until it does. And nobody wants to be strong like we had to be, but you don't really have a choice.
Do you have any sense during all of this journey and the various parts can you think of things that were helpful to you and Barrett, perhaps, that people were able to do or say, and things that weren't particularly helpful? I'm just thinking in a podcast like this, I think there are a lot of people listening who may know of someone and they're kind of say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's helpful.
I would say that one of the biggest things I've noticed about myself and the way that my brain works since Harrison died, or even since he was diagnosed, is that I don't have like really good ability to make decisions. Like being asked to make a decision is like really onerous a lot of the time. So asking someone like, what can I do is an impossible question to answer for somebody like me. So when people take charge of decision making, it's really nice. Like even if it's down to like, we're going for dinner, we're meeting at this time and this is the restaurant, like just get there, right? Not like, what kind of food do you want? Like what kind of restaurant? Like what timing are you thinking? Like that, like it's
no space for that in your brain.
It's overwhelming. It's too much.
I'm free on Tuesday. I'd like to come by and cut your lawn.
Yes.
Would that work for you?
And even like that neighbor who saw the ambulance and just came over and came in the house and said, go. Like for me not to have had to call somebody, and we didn't know her that well. She had been Harrison's babysitter, the one I picked him up from, but for a very short period of time. And then she was our house sitter when we lived in Toronto for like months, but we weren't really great friends. And for her to see an ambulance and just know to like put herself into that situation without saying like, do you want me to, like, is that okay? Like, or not coming over, because she was hesitating about coming over, right? Because I would hesitate. If I saw an ambulance in my neighbor's driveway, I'd be like, well, I don't want to pry, right? I don't want to insert myself. But it was like super helpful that she just said, you go. Julie, I think we've talked about the friends that we had who Harrison died on a Saturday, and we got home Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday morning we kind of woke up and there were people on our porch and we didn't know what was going on, and I opened the door and it was two friends of ours. They have become very close friends now. They weren't very, very close friends at the time, and they had a massive cooler, and it was full of like water bottles and iced teas and beer and whatever. And I was like, what are you doing? And they were like, people are coming. Let them help themselves.
People are going to show up.
People are going to show.
Yeah. People are going to feel like they need to be with you, see you, come pay their respects. And
you don't need to be making sure that they have something to drink.
Yeah.
Let them look after themselves.
Yeah.
That's a very, very insightful and helpful piece, I think, because so often we sit back and wait and think, as you say, I don't want to be intrusive. And people can be intrusive. That's true. There's the other side of it. But I think there's a sense of trusting that if I can see something that would be helpful, I need to just offer it and just say, would it be okay if I
would like
did
to do this?
Yeah. So I think that's a very helpful piece. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say like less helpful would be, and this is all my impressions of what the people around me were expecting of me. So that's my bias, I guess. But I felt after a certain period of time that there was an expectation that we were like, okay, so we'll just get on with things now, or that I was going to go back to who I was, which is just not a reality that will ever come to pass. So that expectation felt a bit overwhelming. And then a lot of people that we were close to who I felt had that expectation of us that we weren't meeting, they then kind of just faded away a little bit, which I guess you have to accept as like people can take on what they feel they can take on. And if people didn't feel like they could take on supporting us forever and ever through this, if that's how long it took, then they kind of have to listen to that too.
Yeah, that's a long period of time, a long journey.
Right.
Yeah. And I can't imagine, you're right when you say you're not the same person. You can't live unchanged by what you've experienced in terms of not just watching that, but being part of it in so many ways. And I think too, as you mentioned, your background in nursing just kind of opened another door. I'm listening to you thinking, okay, if that was somebody who had no experience in nursing and having to deal with a child and doing all of those things, how onerous would that have been on that piece of it? So
I do have to remind myself too, like the things that we did and that we saw during Harrison's treatment before, even as a nurse, I would not have expected that would have been part of the process or the experience of having a child in cancer treatments. And so I have to remind myself that we haven't told people a lot of like the nitty-gritty details because they're not details that leave you. I guess I'm protective of what people will take away and how that will impact them. And so they don't really have an understanding of what we saw and what we had to do. And so maybe that alone created distance, right? That prevented that relationship from continuing.
And I think there's also, I wonder, an assumption that because you were a nurse, that you could do that, but you are Harrison's mother.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing that, you're Harrison's mother. When you're bandaging that wound from the burst tumor, you're his mom having to do nursing duties.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've got two things in my head. I don't know if the first one's, if it's fair, and if it isn't fair, then you feel free to say. But there's someone out there right now going through something similar, right? Do you have any words or any thoughts or anything that is on your head that said that might benefit them to hear from you, having gone through the story?
Honestly, I don't think so.
Okay. I didn't know if that was fair.
I mostly because I don't know that I would have been receptive to hearing from me.
Right. The world had gotten so tight.
And it has to.
Yeah.
And is that the element of crisis? Like, it's just, what is the next thing that
maybe
we have to do?
I think if someone had come to me at that time and said, like, my child had cancer, he's doing really well, I would have been angry because we didn't have any guarantees that that was going to be our outcome. And if someone had come to me like me and said, my child had cancer, they died, this was what I learned from that, I would have been angry because my kid's not going to die.
So then the see and do really is see something that could be done that would be supportive and helpful and just do it.
Yeah.
That is really the...
Just do it.
Just do it.
Someone came, I think, and took down our Christmas lights when we were away at one point and never told us, right? We just like months later were like, oh, we didn't do that. I wonder who did.
Right. And I kind of got lost in the story. How old was Harrison when he died?
He was almost 3. So he was 2 years and 9 months. Yep.
Harrison got to meet his brother Jack.
Harrison got to meet Jack.
Didn't get to meet his sister.
He didn't get to meet Isla, and Isla didn't get to meet him.
Yeah.
Which they fight about.
Oh, they do.
Because Jack is his real brother, because he met him, and Isla's not his real sister.
Gotta love siblings.
Oh,
right?
Siblings will just find any way
I know,
to hurt
it just
each other
hurts
sometimes.
my heart so much for a little Isla.
Yeah.
But I do love for Jack that that's like a bit of a badge of honor for him. Yeah.
That feels important to him.
It is very important to him. Yeah.
I want to thank you, Shannon, for the courage, but also the respect. And I believe this, and I know you and Barrett honor that. But this is Harrison's story, and you're the guardian of his story. And nobody has a right to that story unless you offer that. And so you've offered, I've used this word to describe certain places and stories, and the word is simply a sacredness. That I think that's the respect I have for Harrison's story and for you folk and for sharing that. I agree with you when you say, we don't always share all the details, and that's that's not just a protective thing. I think that's an honoring thing too. That's okay. Nobody needs to know everything about everything.
Yeah.
But it's your story. It's Harrison's story, and you're the guardian of that. We're just so grateful that you've allowed us to be part of that, and thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Harrison. It's how we bring him forward in time with us, right? So I think all the time about all these things that have happened since he died. Like there have been lots of big things in the world that have happened, right? Like COVID, and like what would it be like for him if he were here, and would he even recognize the house? Like and it's funny what your brain does, right? Because you go like, if he were to come home, would he recognize the house?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So telling the story is how we keep him moving forward with us.
And it's how we get to know him.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you did it so gracefully.
Thank you.